Alright, we are back at it. Paul Graham Hesses, and we are having essay number 182 from December 2019, and it's about having kids. Before I had kids, I was afraid of having kids. Up to that point, I felt about kids the way the young Augustine felt about living virtuously. I, I'd have been sad if I think I'd never have children. But I did. But did I want them now? No. If I had kids, I'd become a parent. And parents, had known since I was a kid, were uncool. Those were dull, responsible, and no fun. And while it's not surprising that kids would believe that, to be honest, I hadn't seen much as an adult to change my mind. Whenever I noticed parents with kids, the kids seemed to be terrors, and the parents pathetic, harried creatures, even when they are prevailed. When people had babies, I congratulated them enthusiastically, because that seemed to be what one did. But I didn't feel it at all. Better you than me, I was thinking. Now, when people have babies, I congratulate them enthusiastically, and I mean it. Especially the first one. I feel like they just got the best gift in the world. What changed, of course, that is that I had kids. Something I dreaded turned out to be wonderful. Partly, I won't deny it, this is because of the serious chemical changes that happened almost instantly when our first child was born. It was like someone flipped the switch. I suddenly felt protective, not just towards our child, but toward all children. As I was driving my wife and a new son home from the hospital, I approached a crosswalk full of pedestrians, and I found myself thinking, I have to be really careful of all these people. Every one of them is someone's child. So, to some extent, you can't trust me when I say having kids is great. To some extent, I'm like religious cultist telling you that you'll be happy if you join the cult too. But only because joining the cult will alter your mind in a way that will make you happy to be a cult member. But not entirely. There were some things about having kids that I clearly got wrong before I had them. For example, there was a huge amount of selection bias in my observations of parents and children. Some parents may have noticed that I wrote whenever I noticed parents with kids. Of course, the times I've noticed with kids were when the things were going wrong. I only noticed them when they made noise. And where was I when I noticed them? Ordinarily, I never went to places with kids. So the only times I encountered them were in standard bottlenecks at like airplanes, which is not exactly a representative sample. Flying with a toddler is something very few parents enjoy. What I didn't notice, because they tend to be much quieter, were all great moments parents had with kids. People don't talk about this much. The magic is hard to put into words, and all parents know about them anyway. But one of the great things about having kids is that there are so many times when you feel there is nowhere else you'd rather be and nothing else you'd rather be doing. You don't have to be doing anything special. You could just be going somewhere together, or putting them to bed, or pushing them to swings at the park. But you wouldn't trade these moments for anything. One doesn't tend to associate kids with peace, but that's what you feel. You don't need to look any further than where you are right now. Before I had kids, I had moments of this kind peace, but they were rarer. With the kids, it can happen several times a day. My other source of data about kids was my own childhood, and that was similarly misleading. I was pretty bad, and was always in trouble for something or other. So it seemed to me that parenthood was essentially law enforcement. I didn't realize that there were good times too. I remember my mother telling me once that when I was 30 that she'd rather enjoy having me and sister. My god, I thought, this woman is a saint. She not only endured all the pain we subjected to her, but actually enjoyed it. Now I realize she was simply telling the truth. She said that the only reason she liked having us was that we'd been interesting to talk to. That took me by surprise when I had kids. You don't just love them, they become your friends too. They are really interesting, and I admit small children are disastrously, disastrously fond of repetition. Anything worth doing once is is worth doing 50 times. It's often genuinely fun to play with them. That surprised me too. Playing with a 2-year-old was fun when I was 2, and definitely not fun when I was 6. Why would it become fun again later? But it does. There are of course times that are pure drudgery, or worse, still terror. Having kids is one of those intense types of experience that are hard to imagine unless you had them. But it's not as simply as I implicitly believe. Before having kids, simply your DNA heading for lifeboats. Some of my worries about having kids were right though. They definitely make you less productive. I know having kids makes some people get their act together, but if your act was together already, you're going to have less time to do it in. In particular, if you're going to have to work to a schedule, kids have schedules. I'm not sure if it's because that's how kids are or because it's the only way to integrate their lives with adults. But once you have kids, you tend to have to work on their schedule. You'll have chunks of time to work, but you can't let work spill promiscuously through your whole life, like I used to before I had kids. You're going to have to work at the same time every day, whether inspiration is flowing or not, and there are going to be times when you have to stop, even if it is. I've been able to adapt to working this way. Work like love finds a way. If there are only certain times it can happen, it happens at those times. So while I don't get as much done as before I had kids, I get done enough. I hate to say this because being ambitious has always been a part of my identity, but having kids may make one less ambitious. It hurts to see that sentence written down. I squirm to avoid it, but if there weren't something real there, why would I squirm? The fact is, once you have kids, you're probably going to care more about them than you would be caring about yourself. The attention is a zero sum game. One on Only one idea at a time can be on the top idea in your mind. Can be the top idea in your mind. Once you have kids, it will often be your kids, and that means it will less often be some project you're working on. I often find I have I have some I have some hacks for sailing close to this wind. For example, when I write essays, I think about what I would want my kids to know. That drives me to get things right. And when I was writing, well, I told my kids that once I finished it, I'd take them to I would take them to Africa. When you say that sort of thing to a little kid, they treat it as a promise, which meant I had to finish or I'd be taking away their trip to Africa. Maybe if I'm really lucky, such trick could put me in net ahead, but the wind is there, no question. On the other hand, what kind of wimpy ambition do you have if you won't survive having kids? Do you have so little to spare? And while having kids may be wrapping my present judgment, it hasn't overwritten my memory. It hasn't overwritten my memory. I remember perfectly well what life was like before, well enough to miss some things a lot, like the ability to take off for some other country at moment's notice. That was so great. Why did I never do that? See what I did there? The fact is, most of the freedom I had before kids I never used. I paid for it in loneliness, but I never used it. I had plenty of happy times before I had kids. But if I count up happy moments, not just potential happiness, but actually happy moments, there are more after kids than before. Now I practically have it on tap almost any bedtime. People's experiences as parents vary a lot, and I know I've been lucky. But I think the very worries I had before having kids must be pretty common. Judging by other parents' faces when they see their kids, so must the happiness that kids bring. Lesson to unlearn. This is big. And interesting. Obviously interesting. Same thing, December 2019, 181. 181. Okay. The most damaging thing you learned in school wasn't something you learned in any specific class. It was learning to get good grades. When I was in college, a particularly earnest philosophy grad student once told me that he never cared what grade he got in class, only what he learned in it. This stuck in my mind because it was the only time I've ever heard anyone say such thing. For me, as far as most students, the measurement of what I learned completely dominated actual learning in college. I was fairly earnest. I was genuinely interested in most of the classes I took and I worked hard. And yet, I worked by far the hardest when I was studying for a test. In theory, tests are merely what their name implies, tests of what you have learned in the class. In theory, you shouldn't have to prepare for a test in a class any more than you have to prepare for a blood test. In theory, you learn from taking a class, from going to lectures and doing reading and or assignments, and the test that comes afterwards merely measures how well you learned. In practice, as almost everyone will know, reading this will know, things are so different that hearing this explanation of how classes and tests must meant to work is like hearing about etymology of a word whose meaning has changed completely. In practice, the phrase studying for a test was almost redundant because that was when one really studied. The difference between Delight and the Slack students was that former studied hard for tests and the latter didn't. No one was pulling all-nighters 2 weeks before the semester. Even though I was a diligent student, almost all the work I did in school was aimed to get a good grade on something. To many people, it would seem strange that the preceding sentence has a through as though in it. Aren't I merely stating a tautology? Even though I was a diligent student, almost all the work I did in school was aimed to get a good grade in something. To many people, it would seem strange that the preceding statement has a though in it. Aren't I merely standing a tautology? Isn't that what diligent student is? A straight A student. That's how deeply a conflation of learning with grades has infused in a culture. Is it so bad if learning is conflated with grades? Yes, it is bad. And it wasn't till decades that after college, when I was running Y Combinator, that I realized how bad it is. If I knew, of course, when I was a student, that studying for a test is far from identical with actually learning it. As at the very least, you don't retain knowledge, you cram your head the night before exam. But the problem is worse than that. The real problem is that most tests don't come close to measuring what they are supposed to. the tests truly were tests of learning, things wouldn't be so bad. Getting good grades and learning would converge. Just a little late. The problem is that nearly all tests given to students are terribly hackable. Most people who've gotten good grades know this and know it so well they've ceased even to question it. You'll see when you realize how naive it sounds to act otherwise. Suppose you're suppose you're taking a class on medieval history. The final exam is coming up. The final exam is supposed to be a test of your knowledge on medieval history, right? So, if you have a couple days between now and the exam, surely the best way to spend time if you want to do well in exam is to read the best books you can find about medieval history. Then you'll know a lot about it and do well on exam. No, experienced students are saying to themselves. If you merely read good books on medieval history, most of the stuff you learn wouldn't be on interest. It's not good books you wanted to read, but the lecture notes and assigned reading in this class. Even most of that you can ignore because you only have to worry about the sort of thing that could turn up as a test question. You're looking for sharply defined chunks of information. If one of the assigned readings has an interesting digression on some subtle point, you can safely ignore that because it's not sort of the thing that could be turned into a test question. But if the professor tells you that there were three undying causes of schism in 1378 and the three consequences of Black Death, you'd better know them. And whether they were in fact the causes or the consequences is beside the point. For the purposes of this class, they are. At a university, there are often copies of old exams floating around, and these narrow still further what you have to learn, as well as learning what kind of questions this professor asks. You'll often get actual exam questions. Many professors reuse them. After teaching a class for 10 years, it would be hard not to, at least inadvertently. In some classes, your professor will have had some sort of political axe to grind, and if so, you will have to grind it too. The need for it varies in classes in math and the hard sciences or engineering is rarely necessary. But at the other end of the spectrum, there are classes where you couldn't get a good grade without it. Getting a good grade in a class X is so different from learning a lot about X that you have to choose one or the other. You can't blame students if they choose grades. Everyone judges them by grades. Graduate programs, employers, scholarships, even their own parents. I like learning and I really enjoyed some of the papers and programs I wrote in college. But did I ever, after turning in a paper in some class, sit down and write another? Just for fun? Of course not. I had things due to other classes. I had things due in other classes. If it ever came to the choice of learning or grades, I'd choose grades. I hadn't come to college to do badly. Anyone who cares about getting good grades has to play this game. They'll be surpassed by those who do. And the elite universities, that means nearly everyone. Since someone who didn't care about getting good grades probably wouldn't be there in the first place, the result is that students compete to maximize the difference between learning and getting good grades. Why tests are so bad? More precisely, why are they so hackable? Any experienced programmer could answer that. How hackable is software whose author hasn't paid any attention to preventing it from being hacked? Usually, it's as porous as colander. Hackable is a default for any test imposed by authority. The reason that tests you're given are so consistently bad, so consistently far from measuring what they are supposed to measure, is simply that the people creating them haven't made much effort to prevent them from being hacked. But you can't blame teachers on the tests. That if the tests are hackable, their job is to teach, not to create unhackable tests. The real problem is grades, and more precisely, that grades have been overloaded. If grades were merely a way for teachers to tell a student what they were doing right and wrong, like a coach giving advice to an athlete, students wouldn't be tempted to hack tests. But unfortunately, after a certain age, grades become more important, more than advice. After a certain age, whenever you're being taught, you're usually also being judged. I've used college tests as an example, but those are actually the least hackable. All the tests most students take in their whole lives are at least as bad, including the most spectacularly of all, the test that gets from them into college. If getting into college is merely a matter of having a quality of one's mind measured by admissions officers, that way of scientists measuring the mass of a object, we could tell teenage kids, learn a lot, leave it at that. You can tell how bad college admissions are as a test, from how unlike how high school that sounds. In practice, the freakishly specific nature of the stuff ambitious kids have to do in high school is directly proportional to the hackability of college admissions. The classes you don't care about are the mostly memorization and random extracurricular activities you have to participate in to show you are well rounded. The standardized tests are as artificial as tests. The essay you have to write, that's presumably meant to hit some very specific target, but you're not told what. As well as being bad in what it does to kids, this test is also bad in the sense of being very hackable. So hackable, so hackable that whole industries have grown up to hack it. This is the explicit purpose of test prep companies and admission counselors, but it's also a significant part of the function of private schools. Why is this particular test so hackable? I think because of what it's measuring. Although the popular story is that the way to get into a good college is to really be smart. Admission officers at elite colleges neither are or claim to be looking only for that. What are they looking for? They're looking for people who are not simply smart but admirable in some most general sense. And how is this more general admirableness measured? The admissions officers feel it. In other words, they accept those who they like. So, what college admissions is a test of is whether you suit the taste of some group of people. Well, of course, a test like that is going to be hackable, and because it's both very hackable and there is thought to be a lot of stake that hacked like nothing else. That is like hacked like nothing else. That's why it distorts your life so much for so long. It's no wonder high school students often feel alienated. The shape of their lives is completely artificial. But wasting your time is not the worst thing that education system does to you. The worst thing it does is to train you that the way to win is by hacking bad tests. This is much subtler. This is much subtler. This is a much. This is a much subtler, subtle, subtler. Okay, subtler. This is a much subtler problem that I didn't recognize until I saw it happening to other people. When I started advising startup founders at Y Combinator, especially young ones, I was puzzled by the way they always seem to make things overcomplicated. How they would ask, do you raise money? What's the trick for making venture capitalists want to invest in you? The best way to make VCs want to invest in you, I would explain, is to actually be a good investment. Even if you could trick VCs into investing in a bad startup, you'd be tricking yourself too. You're investing time in the same company you're asking them to invest money in. If that's not a good investment, why are you even doing it? Oh, they'd say that And then, after a pause of digest of revelation, they ask, what makes a good startup? What makes a startup a good investment? So I would explain that what makes a startup promising, not just in the eyes of investors, but in the fact is growth, ideally in revenue, but failing that in usage. What they needed to do was get a lot of users. How does one get a lot of users? They had all kinds of ideas about it. They needed to do a big launch that would get them exposure. They needed influential people to talk about them. They even knew they needed to launch on Tuesday because that's when one gets the most attention. No, I would explain. That is not how you get a lot of users. The way you get a lots of users is to make the product really good. Then people will not only use it but recommend it to their friends. So your growth will be exponential once you get it started. Oh my god. At this point, I've told the founders something you'd think would be completely obvious, that they should make a good company by making a good product. And yet the reaction would be something like the reaction many physicists must have had when they first heard about the theory of relativity, a mixture of astonishment as it appears genius combined with suspicion that anything so weird couldn't possibly be right. Okay, what they say dutifully, and could you introduce us to such and such influential person? And remember, we want to launch on Tuesday. It would sometimes take founders years to grab these simple lessons, and not because they were lazy or stupid, they just seemed blind to what was right in front of them. Why would I would ask myself, do they always make things so complicated? And then one day I realized this was not a rhetorical question. When founders tied themselves in knot doing the wrong things when the answer was right in front of them. Why did founders tie themselves in knots doing the wrong things when the answer was right in front of them? Right in front of them. Because that was what they'd been trying to do. Their education had taught them that the way to win was to hack the test. And without even telling them that they were being trained to do this. The younger ones, the recent graduates, had never faced a non-artificial test. They thought this was just how world worked. The first thing you did when facing any kind of challenge was to figure out that the trick for hacking a test. The trick was for hacking the test. That's why the conversation would always start with how to raise money, because that read as a test. It came at the end of the YC. It had numbers attached to it. The high numbers seemed maybe to be better, and it must be the test. There are certainly big chunks of world where the way to win is to hack the test. This phenomenon isn't limited to schools, and some people, either due to ideology or ignorance, claim that this is true for startups too, but it isn't. In fact, one of the most striking things about startups is the degree to which you win by simply doing good work. There are edge cases, as there are in anything, but in general, you win by getting users. And what users care about is whether the product does what they want. Why did it take me so long to understand why founders made startups so overcomplicated? Because I hadn't realized explicitly that schools train us to win by hacking bad tests. And not just them, but me. I'd been trained to hack bad tests too. I hadn't realized it till decades later. I had lived as if I realized it. But without knowing why. For example, I had avoided working for big companies. But if you'd ask why, I'd say it was because they were bogus or bureaucratic, 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 or just yuck. I never understood why I never understood how much of my dislike of being big companies is due to the fact that you win by hacking bad tests. Similarly, the fact that the tests were unhackable was a lot of what attracted to me about startups. But again, I hadn't realized that explicitly. I had in effect achieved by unsuccess. I had in effect achieved by successful approximations, something that may have a closed form solution. I had gradually undone my training in hacking bad tests without knowing I was doing it. Could someone coming out of the school banish this demon just by knowing its name and saying be gone? It seems worth trying. Merely taking and talking explicitly about this phenomenon is likely to make things better, because much of its power comes from the fact that we take it for granted. After you notice it, it seems the elephant in the room, but it's pretty well camouflaged elephant. The phenomenon is so old and so pervasive, and it's simply the result of neglect. No one meant things to be this way. This is just what happens when you combine learning with grades, competition, and naive assumption of unhackability. It was mind blowing to realize that two of the things I've puzzled about the most, the bogus of high school and the difficulty of getting founders to see the obvious, both have the same cause. It's rare for a big block to slide into a place so late. Usually, when that happens, it has implications in a lot of different areas, and this case seems no exception. For example, it suggests both the education could be done better and how can you fix it. But it also suggests a potential answer to the question all big companies seem to have: how can we be more like a startup? I'm not going to chase down all the implications now, but what I want to focus on here is what it means for individuals. To start with, it means that the most ambitious kids graduating from college have something they may want to unlearn. But it also changes how you look at the world. Instead of looking at all different kinds of work people do, thinking of them vaguely as more or less appealing, you can now also ask a very specific question that will sort them in an interesting way. To what extent do you win at this kind of work by hacking bad tests? It would help if there was a way to recognize bad tests quickly. Is there a pattern here? It turns out there is. Tests can be divided into two kinds: those that are imposed by authorities and those that aren't. Tests that aren't are supposed to be Tests that aren't imposed by authorities are inherently unhackable, in the sense that no one is claiming they are tests of anything more than the actual test. A football match, for example, is simply a test of who wins, not which team is better. You can tell that from the fact that commentators sometimes say afterwards that the better team won. Whereas tests imposed by authorities are usually proxies for something else. A test in a class is supposed to measure not just how well you did on the particular test, but how you learned in the class. While tests that aren't imposed by authorities are inherently unhackable, those imposed by authorities have to be made unhackable. Usually they aren't. So as a first approximation, bad tests are roughly equivalent to tests imposed by authorities. You might actually like to win by hacking bad tests. Presumably, some people do. But I bet most people who find themselves doing this kind of work don't like it. They just take it for granted that this is how the world works unless you want to drop out and be some kind of hippie artisan. I suspect many people implicitly assume that working in a field with bad tests is a price of making lots of money. But that, I can tell you, is false. It used to be true in the mid 20th century when the economy was composed of oligopolies. oligopolies, and the only way to top was by playing their game. But it's not true now. There are now ways to get rich by doing good work, and that's part of the reason people are so much excited about getting rich than they used to be. When I was a kid, you could either become an engineer and make cool things or make a lot of money by becoming an executive. Now you can make a lot of money by making cool things. Hacking back tests is becoming less important as the link between work and authority erodes. The erosion of the link is one of the most important trends happening now. We see its effect in almost every kind of work people do. Startups are one of the most visible examples. But we see much of the same thing in writing. Writers no longer have to submit to publishers, the editors, and the editors to reach readers. Now they can just go direct. The more I think about this question, the more optimistic I get. This seems one of those situations where we don't realize how much something was holding us back until it's eliminated. And I can foresee the whole bogus edifice crumbling. Imagine what happens as more and more people ask start to ask themselves if they want to win by hacking bad tests and decide that they won't. The kinds of work where you win by hacking bad tests will be starved of talent, and the kinds of work where you win by doing good work will see an influx of most ambitious people. As hacking as hacking bad tests shrinks in importance, education will evolve to stop training us to do it. Imagine what the world would could look like if that happened. This is not just a lesson for individuals to unlearn, but a lesson for society to unlearn. We'll be amazed at the energy that's liberated when we do. Alright, that was a good one. So, the lesson to unlearn. So, he's not talking about unlearning things, he's actually talking about something very specific that every person has to unlearn in this generation. And there is no exception. Every freaking guy who has went to school, went to college, or even done something similar to that has something to unlearn immediately. And that is hacking tests. So every test you've done in school or in college, you won by hacking them. Tests are not supposed to be are not supposed to be hackable. They are actually the measure of what you have learned, right? They should show what have you missed, where are you weak at. But instead, they are just hackable. You only figure out ways to actually hack the test. Maybe you are a earnest student and you still want to get good marks. What you do is study well, that too before the exam, right? But that's not the right thing. Tests were supposed to test you how you're learning, not how you're preparing for that exam. This is just crazy. Okay, what I said right now is mind blowing. I didn't know that. Tests are supposed to how you learning, not how prepared the day before. The whole concept of preparing for a test is bogus. And the worst phase is hacking your way through it instead of learning a subject. in that topic. Look for material which will be exam, which contains specific blocks of info. Even worse, getting questions including automation is life. I program C. I don't know why other posts will never blow up. Not even a single like. Anyways. Alright. Let's just make a summary of it. And in here we had learn hacking. Charging thing you learned in school wasn't something you learned in specific in class, but it's learning to get good grades. At university, there are often fears of home. I'm so fat.